So my name's Pete Gore. I'm a business development manager inside of Cisco. I've been with Cisco 20 years. So it's more of a career now as opposed to just a hanging out kind of thing. We're going to be talking about Cloud Center and APIs. Welcome, come on in. We're going to be talking about APIs, how to interact with APIs, and we're going to be interacting with Cloud Center around APIs. So, first of all, any of you have Cloud Center in your environment today? No? Okay. Are you familiar with APIs? A bit, okay. What kind of programming languages are you using today? So, Python, JSON, XML, PowerShell. That's okay. We still use PowerShell to do copies between machines and all that kind of stuff. We still leverage PowerShell scripts. So, we got a quiet guy over there. He's not saying anything. He must be doing email. No? So, That's fair enough. No, you two can't come in. Go away. These are colleagues of mine. So, all right. So today we're going to be talking about Cloud Center, the introduction to Cloud Center, and API usage and how you can leverage APIs to talk to these individual platforms. They have UI interfaces, but obviously it's a lot faster and a lot easier to leverage an API interface, and it's also repeatable because you can then save it and save your variables, etc., and start leveraging variables inside of your APIs to do performance and interact with your box. So we're going to start. We'll take a quick look at Cloud Center, figure out what it's all about, and automation, start discussing, how are we leveraging automation, how does APIs factor into automation, etc. And then we'll start taking a look at the API interaction and then how we can leverage those APIs. Today's talk, we're going to keep it very simple. We're going to be talking about users, how to create VMs, etc. That said, if you want to get hands-on experience, we have the walk-in self-paced labs, where we have some automation labs that you can go talk to, play with, interact, do some programming in Ansible, interact with deploying VMs via the UI over the API, etc. Right? So, good way to get your hands on. And then these three guys at the back are kind of like the brainchilds over there. So they will actually be able to answer your questions if you have deep questions on different things. And then we'll look at a demo. So you'll actually get to see these APIs in action. And then we'll wrap up. Any of the code that we're using today, I did post up on GitHub. So you're able to go there and download the different API JSON code that we're using and leverage that for your own purposes, be able to modify it, and do whatever with that as you go along. All right. So, Cloud Center. Cloud Center is broken up into multiple components. The primary three that you're going to need is going to be your Cloud Center Manager, your Cloud Center Orchestrator, and then what we call the AMQP, which is it runs on RabbitMQ, so it's an open source message bus on the back end, which allows you to communicate between the different platforms. CCM, as we will find out, that's kind of your view into the world. That's where you create your application profiles. That's where you're going to be leveraging your UI, right? So that's the CCM hosts your platform that gives you your nice UI interface, allows you to drag and drop your API, your applications, your VMs, etc. It can provide a self-service catalog to your users, so you can publish out a catalog for users to come in and say, okay, I want this user, I want this VM, or I want this application, and then the workflow that's behind that will then go and produce that and then notify the user, okay, we're good, we've got this. It allows you to do the modeling. It will inform you about your different cost models, and we'll look at that in a little bit. And then also you can leverage RBAC control, so role-based access control, to make sure that not everybody can do everything inside the environment, right? You're going to want different users to be able to do different things. The CCO that we were talking about, so this is the device that sits on the back end. This is kind of like the intelligence. This is what gives you your flexibility across multiple clouds, right? So as you deploy a VMware cloud or an Azure cloud, AWS, whatever it may be, you need a CCO for each of those individual clouds. Now what that does is allows you to abstract your application from the cloud itself, right? Because you have a separate brainchild doing the translations for you for that application to be able to then deploy that application inside those different clouds for you, right? So you don't have to go and figure that out. The CCO does that for you. It also talks to the boxes, so as you deploy your applications, we put an agent on that box itself, which will then talk back to CCO to tell it the status of that box. It gives you proxy SSH control of that box. It allows you to VNC into that box, things like that. But it tells you about the IP address, the status of the box, and it allows you to manage that box, right? Terminate it, shut it down, reboot it, all that kind of good stuff. So you're getting a lot of good stats from that information. And it allows you to do the third-party call-outs, right, which is very important. So interaction, a lot of integration with things like ServiceNow, ACI. Is any of you running ACI inside your environment today? You are? Excellent. You have ACI already?
Just we're testing it right now.
Okay. So we have plugins for that so that you can, again, in the workflow environment, you can say, I want to deploy this VM, but I also want to create this tenant and this EPG and make sure you put this VM inside this tenant and proceed that way, right? So creating that workflow from an end-to-end perspective allows you to make those calls and again, drive that automation so that you don't push a button, it stops halfway, and then your ops guy has to then come in at halfway through the story, change control, all that kind of good stuff. And this is really the heart, right? So the application profile, this is where you're going to model out your application. This is where you're going to build the workflow. This is where you're going to tell it, I want this type of application with this kind of interface, calling out to ServiceNow, your change control, etc. And it's built in JSON. Again, through the UI interface, we can do drag and drop. But then also through an API interface, you can also create your workflows in APIs. The nice thing with the UI interface is it is drag and drop, right? So you can push this into your operations center and say, okay, here's what I need, and you don't then have to have high-end coding people to say, okay, how do I interact with these APIs? What do I do here? What about a job deployment? How about this? They can literally just say, oh, I want Ubuntu. Okay, drag and drop. What version of Ubuntu do you want? And you can drag and do your coding and your version, etc. And it builds out the model for you on the back end that you can then leverage, right? As part of this, you can also build in PostScripts, pre-scripts. So if you want to deploy a web server, right, you can stand up a basic CentOS VM, but then install Nginx and all the different tools that you need on the back end to make that happen. So you can make call out to Ansible. So we have an Ansible plugin that will then allow you to call an Ansible script to make that happen as well, right, which is then starting to leverage the APIs. And that's what I was talking about over in the WISP area. That's actually what we're doing from a modeled perspective, where we're going to deploy an entire web farm, then update the F5 via the API scripts to make sure that that new machine gets added into the VIP to make sure that it then becomes part of your web farm, right? Things like that. So it's a very powerful tool. Again, like we were saying, the multiple clouds, again, you've got to have one of those individual CCOs, but it will talk to multiple different clouds and give you full visibility into that cloud, right? You set up profiles and templates, you can set up costing methodology, so you can actually provide that as a service back to your customer where you say, look, you want to deploy in AWS? That's $5 an hour. You want to deploy in VMware? I've got that local on my site, I've got spare disk, etc. I'm going to charge you $1 an hour for that, right? So you can set up individual cost models back to individual areas. You can also set up different profiles. So how many times when you're working with your users and they come in and you say, okay, I'm going to stand up an FTP server, but I want 16 cores of CPU, I want 2 terabytes of RAM, I want this, I want that, and you go, okay, and you deploy, right? Now with the cost modeling, I'm able to come back and say, okay, if you want that, that's $2,000 a month. Or I can give you this, and it's $10 a month, right? And they go, oh, I want the $10 a month option. Great. What does that do? That allows you to keep your resources as well and then able to leverage and drive your applications in a way that makes sense for you, right? And for the business itself. Well, like I said, this gives you full visibility across all your different clouds, and then pulls it all together in a single dashboard so that you can see what is the cloud cost that you're currently running right now by cloud, your cloud status by region, the different VMs that you have running inside each of those different clouds, which is contributing to your cost model. All right? Question?
Yeah. So the cloud cost models,
Yes.
are they predefined within Cloud Center, or can you put in your own?
You can put in, absolutely, you put in your own, as you build out the model and the template, you can say for this environment, it's costing me X, right? And my margin is 20%, so, or you may be doing it at cost, whatever it may be, back to your individual users.
So can you change it from, say, a static price where you say, right, you know, like some cloud vendors do t-shirt sizing,
Yes,
whereas there's some that work like utilities where they actually charge on when the VM's actually powered on. So
exactly.
you can actually do that.
Yes. And so the other nice thing is by each of these clouds, you can actually build out a separate template per cloud. So you can say, you know, if you want one CPU with 4 gigs of RAM, that'll cost you $10. However, if you want 4 CPUs with 16 gigs of RAM, that'll cost you $10 per hour, right? And you can define it by hour, by month, and you can put time in there as well. So you can say, you know, during these hours, if you're using it, it'll cost you X. During these times, it'll cost you Y. And so you've got complete flexibility over your cost model and then how you can charge it back, etc. So it's very powerful. The other thing is the runtime, right? So you can actually see who you're using most, why you're using it, you know, and be able to drive that again back to your users. Okay. So why are we doing this? Obviously, I mean, I'm sure you guys all have your stuff completely under control, and your users are not, you know, running around doing all that good stuff. But, you know, as applications grow with Docker, Jenkins, Oracle, Splunk, Hadoop, right? The infrastructure across our environments is growing nothing but more complex, right? So we have to be able to get a handle on that. We have to be able to charge that back, handle our cost. How many of you are actually using a cost model inside your infrastructure? Back to your customers, yeah? Is it working? So? Okay. So, you know, when we talk about cloud these days, hybrid is kind of the way to go, right? Or hybrid is the vast majority. So what does cloud mean? Everyone wants to be in the cloud. How do we get there? And that's really where the automation and the APIs and the integration piece that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, that's really where this is going to come in to enable your life as operators to be able to actually leverage this environment in a truly optimized fashion, right? This isn't about getting rid of people. This is about working smarter and making yourself more valuable to an organization. So we need to be able to integrate. We need to be able to model, right? Model once, but then deploy across multiple applications and multiple clouds. So I might model out an application and build out Splunk, and I want to deploy Splunk or Microsoft Office or whatever it may be, right? A web server. But in some instances, some people are going to need it on AWS, some are going to need it on VMware, some are going to need it on Azure. We don't know. But the nice thing is we model it right here. So this is the architect's view of the model, right? This is what drives your interaction, your cost model, etc., right? Your security. And then, but once I've modeled it, now I can say, okay, it's available to be deployed in VMware. It's available to be deployed in AWS. And then Cloud Center takes care of all of that on the back end for you, depending on the profile that you pick. And then to manage and to deploy, as we already talked. The other key aspect here is the integration, right? The ability to extend your platform, and this is really where the APIs are going to come in, right? Because when you start talking to third-party devices, APIs are really going to be what gives you that ability and that power to be able to interact with the different tool sets like ServiceNow, like Jenkins, right? So how do we handle this from a content perspective? How do I talk across these different platforms? I don't want to try and have to build UI interfaces. I'm going to build APIs, use REST, because it's fairly standard and it's already out there. We just need to learn how to use it, right? So like you can see, we've got platform integration, we've got the tool integration, between the hooks, all the different hooks within inside the environment. So the Ansible modules, the Python modules, right? XML, JSON, being able to build JSON bodies inside of our API calls, and then using variables inside of those, right? So use the power of those tools whilst leveraging a common platform across all your different clouds. And so security, obviously very important. The ability to tie into info blocks, right? And do DNS and IPAM capabilities in an automated fashion by making calls out to those different devices, right? And we'll see that when we look at the demo later. We'll wrap up with deploying a VM via APIs. And you'll see the VM spin up. It's only a single tier VM. Again, this is an introduction, so we kept it fairly simple. But we'll deploy a VM and you'll see it come up. And from a DHCP perspective, it will pull its IP address, it'll deploy, and it'll be running. And you'll have full access to that box to see what's going on, again, via that agent that we talked about earlier, right? And we'll look at that in the demo. I will caution you, live demos, it's always great when you're at a conference like this to try and do a live demo, but we're going to go for it. So again, some examples. So when you're looking at these type of things, this is where you really get your power, right? Especially from an API perspective. The fact that you can tie into so many different tool sets. You can tie into ACI via the REST interfaces. You can tie into your networking infrastructure, your Nexus infrastructure. You can leverage open source tool sets like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, right? When we go out to talk to customers these days, nobody wants to hear, well, you need to buy my product, and no, you can't use that Ansible that you've invested in already. Info blocks, yeah, that's okay, but we have a much better, so nobody wants to hear that, right? And we like those customers that do want to hear that, trust me as a Cisco person, but nobody does. So the ability to tie into different things like info blocks, like SolarWinds, because a lot of people are actually using SolarWinds as a management platform, right? So that's what they're using to gain insight into their infrastructure, syslogs, collecting syslogs, etc. So how do we use all of that? How do we drive towards a DevOps model, right? So we're doing CI/CD in a logical fashion, and obviously with CI/CD, your APIs are going to be critical, right? So real quick, and then we'll jump into the API section. This is your user view, again, the service catalog perspective, right? So you can offer this out to your customers. And what's happening on the back end here, this is where your APIs then kick in and go make all that happen for you. And then your cost model kicks off, and hopefully you receive an email that says, hey, Pete deployed VM such and such, and he wants it for 2 weeks, and it's going to, he picked this template. Okay, great, right? Now you're just aware that that's happened without actually receiving a change ticket that meant you had to then go spin up a VM or spin up a new server, etc. The architect view, this is where you guys are going to come in from a drag and drop perspective or an API perspective where you build out what do I actually want to do, right? So in this instance, I'm deploying an Apache server, I'm deploying Nginx on it, I'm loading up a SQL database, and that's done in a workflow perspective. Again, through the interactions, it just deploys, right? And the only time you should have to get involved is when something goes wrong. And then you'll receive a notification. But nothing ever goes wrong, right? So we're all good on that one. Okay, any questions at this point? So you guys can move forward, it's okay, I don't bite. I even showered this morning, it's really good. All right, so when we look at APIs, who can use the API infrastructure inside your environment? Well, basically anybody, right? You're going to have an admin administrator, obviously, right, who's going to have complete control of the system. But your users can use APIs as well. They can leverage the system and pull information out. Now, do we want a user to be able to see everything inside our environment? There might be cost models, reporting, all this kind of stuff that we don't want our users to see. So that's where the RBAC control comes into play, right? So I give a user a specific set of privileges. They can manage a cloud, they can pull reports, whatever it may be, but we get to control what they can see via the API. When we tell them you can't do something, and they try to do it anyway, they get a wonderful 403 error message saying, sorry, you can't do that, right? Which means they either have to then ask for the permissions, or they escalate or do whatever, right? But the nice thing to know is even when you're leveraging the API platform, Yes, it's open source. Yes, it's fully available, but if you don't have the permissions to use it, the system tells you, sorry, you don't have the permissions to use it. So, what kind of APIs can we actually do inside or leverage inside our environment, right? So as you can see, there's a great deal of capability, and this is just a subsection of the different API capabilities within inside the platform. There's actually documentation, which will be at the end of the presentation, that you can go see, and there's an entire section on just APIs, right? And it gives you true visibility into what's happening, but it also gives you an understanding of what the power of the API can actually do. So, user management, we're going to focus on that one. Again, it's very simple, but it allows you to manage via the APIs your user interaction and what your users can do, your permissions, what they can see, what tenants they can see, etc. Application management. This is probably the API that you're going to leverage a lot because that's what it's all about, right? You don't want to just switch on users, switch off users. You want to be able to actually deploy applications inside your environment. So how do you do that? You can look at them, you can delete them, you can export them to different platforms and different clouds. And so this is a highly used version. Now, the other nice thing here is looking at the inventory of your environment, right? So the ability to manage your VMs inside the environment, right? The ability to shut it down. Now, because I can shut them down, I can power them off, or I can terminate them completely, I'm able to leverage automation to make that happen because I have the API calls. I can write jobs that say, you know what, at the end of the day, Pete spun up this application. He said he only needs it for 8 hours. At the end of 8 hours, I can switch it off, right? So now I'm getting into cost management inside my environment, resource management inside my environment. I can vMotion it to a different cloud, or I can move it off to a less expensive cloud if it's not being used, all via the API, via automation scripts, right? And then, of course, reporting. Everybody wants to know about what's actually going on inside the environment. So the reporting is very capable, right, or very important. The other nice thing here is, and we'll talk about versioning next, is by having V1 and V2, in V2 versions of APIs, you can gather a lot more statistics and a lot more capabilities, right? So that's what you'll find across a lot of the different APIs is there are capabilities to look at it leveraging a V1 version and a V2 version, and then see the differences in the amount of details that you can look at. And when we look at the demo, I'll show you that how it brings back a link that says, hey, if you want to see more details, click on this, and then you get a lot more information. So, not that anybody here is probably going to leverage this now, but prior to 4.6, only V1 was available, right? Now we're up to 4.10, so V2 is very prevalent. We're coming out with version 5 in the next few weeks, so version 2 is obviously a lot more prevalent in this environment. Now, when we talk about API versions, when you pull your information back, everything inside the API is going to be keyed to an ID, right? That ID is going to be unique to whatever you're doing, it be an application, a parent application, a child application, a child function, a user name, templates, everything has an ID. Now, to further distinguish, like for a user interaction, right? A user may have an ID of 2, but they're also going to have a user name, right? And we want that user name to be unique, and we'll look at that in a second as well. We want that username to be unique. So what if I have 2 Petes, right, that I've spun up inside my environment? Well, I can't have Pete and Pete, even though they've got separate IDs. I'm then going to put a delimiter on there that says Pete underscore Y or Pete underscore dot, right, to separate my Pete from somebody else, right? But it's all tied back to the ID, and we can pull that information. So it's very important to understand that when you're trying to access these things, IDs are very critical. And it's very easy to find out what that ID is just through a few gets, right? So we'll look at that in a bit. Just put this in here to show, again, it's the API really that we're looking at here, right? So we build our all-inclusive, all-important application profile. It's the API that's actually making the calls back to the platform, right? So understanding how those APIs work, what they're doing, what those error messages get. And the kind of intimidating thing with APIs when you're looking at them is, what if I get an error? How do I deal with the fact that I got an error, right? But you're used to seeing those errors. When we looked at it earlier, when a user made a request that they weren't entitled to, you saw a 403. Anyone using a web browser has seen that error before, right? Sorry, you cannot have access to this. 403, right? Or a 201 or a 200 that says, okay, yes, everything was good, right? It's a different way of looking at it because you don't have a web interface right in front of you to say, this is a status code and put up a nice little splash screen that says this is a message. But you get the same kind of status codes back via the API as you do typically when you're using a web browser, right? So it's something key to understand is it's not quite as intimidating as you think. So, questions at this point? No? Making sense? Okay. So again, when you look at REST APIs, has anybody played with these in their own environment, in a lab? Have you tried leveraging an API to get information from something? Okay. And so these are probably familiar to, for those who are nodding, these are probably familiar to you, right? It's like get information, post information back to the system, right? A put information into the system. Delete, well, obvious, right? Delete information from the system. So these are very consistent, very logical ways of interacting with the system to make sure that it can actually do what it needs to do. The URL, when we talk about the URL, this is where you're talking back to, for Cloud Center, you're talking back to the CCM, right? Typically when you're leveraging a URL, you're going to be leveraging the device that you want to get the information from. And a URL is just, again, like in a web browser, right? Except instead of you can use DNS, you can use the IP address, but then you need to know the address of what it is that you're trying to go to, right? So that's what we mean by the URL. And in a Cloud Center's case, I typically use an IP address. I'm lazy. I can remember IP addresses a lot easier than I can remember DNS because I'm freaky that way. So I use the IP address as my CCM, I type that in as my URL, and then I go get my information, or I post my information. The port, if I'm using an off default port, right? The default port for Cloud Center is 443, right? HTTPS. If I've set it up so I'm using a different port number, then obviously I need to tell it what port number to go look at so it can get the information or still get the information. The resource, so when I was talking about the address resources that we're going after, this is what I'm talking about, right? So in this instance, I'm going after my user information. And so it's a V1 API, and I want user information, right? And so that will tell it's like an address book. It goes into the platform, it goes in, it hits the URL and says, okay, I'm looking for the user interaction, pull the users back, and that's the information I'm receiving. The request body, we'll look at the request body in a minute. That's a JSON script, so if you're looking to do something more intuitive or more complex than just getting a list of users, which hopefully that's what you're going to be using your APIs for, then we need to tell it what we want to do, what we want to post, what information we want to receive back, right? So if it's an application, when we deploy the VM, for example, you'll notice that the JSON script is about 126 lines. Now again, you don't need to be intimidated by that because a lot of the information that you need, you can get via the API. And you say, okay, I need this information, this information, this information. How do I get that? Well, I leverage the get, I leverage the address of the information that I want environment information. All right, I go to V1 environments, right? The information I need is there, I take that information and I put that into my body of the VM deployment information, right? Because now I know what the application is I'm after, I know what the ID is, and that's the information I need to populate. API credentials, very, very important. Also different from your username. So when you log in and it's Pete at ClickAttack, that's not my username, right? Nor is the password that I have to log in also going to be my password to get to access to the APIs. You need an API key. And so the API key is going to be located inside of Cloud Center. It has to be generated, right? It can be regenerated, it can be respawned. However, you go to users. So here's my list of users that I have. And as you can see in this instance, this user does not, so this is my admin user, right? He doesn't have an API key at this point. However, we gave you a handy dandy little button that says, generate me a key, right? But you'll also notice that my user here is admin. This is how I log into the UI, admin at ClickerTech. However, my username for my API access is clicker admin, right? Again, we don't want to make it too easy for these guys because APIs are very powerful, right? We can do a lot of stuff on the back end and we can do it really fast, right? So we want to make it a little more difficult for them to get to, and the key that doesn't exist, we generate. As you can see, it's nice and easy to remember, right? It generates a nice little code for you to be able to just rattle off. However, if you know, and you can set this up to regenerate every day, right? Because if for whatever reason you don't want somebody to have access, or you've given your key to somebody else to go do something, you can regenerate. Also, if you have requirements, you know, security requirements inside your environment, a lot of users have to regenerate their passwords every 60 days, 90 days, 3 months, whatever it may be. You can have the same thing for your API key, right? You can have the same requirements. And that could fall to your admin, it could fall to an ops user, et cetera, to go in and just generate new keys. Okay? But it's a very important piece of information. How many of you are familiar with curl? Have you used it before? A little bit? Yeah? It's a nice little handy dandy little Linux command, right? In this instance, you just got to be able to build it out. So as you can see here, I've got my clicker admin user. I've got my API key built into the curl response. I'm telling it I want to accept applications. I'm doing a get. This is my URL, right? So remember when we were talking about the URL? Again, something you're very familiar with from a web browser, right? HTTPS. Again, I told you I don't use DNS names. I'm kind of lazy. So I put my IP address in, and this is what I want to get back, the information I want to get back, right? So, just showing you the regular information. Now, doesn't that look pretty? Right? That's just a standard URL response from a curl command, right? I can go hunting through here and say, okay, here's the username I used, the password, we redacted the password, right, for that particular user. But here's my information. Here's the tenants that he's in, right? His last name's admin, the company name, et cetera, right? Wonderful way to try and find information. And it was super fast. However, rather than try and read that, we can put a little bit of Python code in here, right? Put a little, leverage a little tool called JSON and print it out nice and pretty. So I don't know which one you prefer. This one, or this one. I prefer this. A little easier to read, right? But it's just an example of not everything has to come out, and again, it's not designed to be intimidated, right? With a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of manipulation, you can make it look pretty and you can make it much more usable and friendly. That said, curl is great, right? To being able to do check things, look at things, etc. There are a lot of applications out there that would probably make your API experience a lot nicer, right? This is a little application. It's called Postman. It's free. You can download it. It makes it look pretty for you automatically. It gives you the ability to store your queries, right, off to the side. You can build collections of things that you want to look at and be able to pull back on a regular basis. So if you're regularly looking at users, you're regularly looking at your applications, you're regularly pulling reports, this is a really nice way of doing it because you store the information and you just say, hey, give me my list of users, send. And it pulls it back and it does this. And you can look, you know, you set your various, if you want it in JSON, if you want it in XML, whatever, your response can be pulled back. You're then able to export this information and leverage it from there, right? If you want to leverage this information in a Python script and build out a whole bunch of variables, this is a good way to get the information, and then Python can pass through that and pull that into a main body of a file. So again, driving towards that full end-to-end automation solution, right? And as you can see up here, the status codes that I was talking about earlier, right? 200 means it's okay. I got a response, right? So again, not so bad. Questions? Anyone familiar with this kind of stuff? Awesome. All right, so what do I want to do with these APIs, right? They're all wonderful. They give me lots of information, as we've seen. What can I actually do with these ACIs? So user activation, deletion, right? Very common aspect inside of a lot of different environments, right? A lot, depending on the type of environment that you have, you can leverage APIs to then activate, delete, disable different types of users inside your environment. Setting up clouds. So I want to set up AWS, but I don't want to have to go through the 20 or 30 clicks inside the UI. And I happen to have set up VMware before, and I happen to have set up Azure before, so I know all the criteria that I need, put those variables into an API script, send it into the platform, it will build that system out for you, right? Application deployment, great use case, right? Make that available on a service portal, so a customer wants to spin up a web server, a SQL server, whatever it may be. Make this available as an application on the portal itself. Click, one push for them, automate the back end. It goes and deploys the system, starts deploying the cost, sends you an email, says, hey, we have a new VM on this box, on this cluster, in this cloud, and this is, and it's using for user Pete, right? And then migrations. Now, migrations via APIs, we're starting to get into the more complex ways of doing things, but absolutely feasible. And again, when you think back to Postman, you can create your variables, you can create your files that will leverage those variables and make this happen on a recurring basis, okay? So we're going to focus on the simple side of it, right? We're going to look at users. They're always being added, deleted from software. And if you want to see the different commands that you're running, the curl commands, you can actually pipe the output to a response file, right? So in this instance, we call it response headers. It'll recreate that file every time you run the curl. So that if you do get an error message, you can now go look at that text file and see exactly what happened, right? In Cloud Center, there's a difference between creating a user and that user actually being able to do something. So you have to be able to activate that user. And again, the variables can be provided via CSV, and when we do the demo, I'll show you like a very simple example of a CSV file that has a bunch of variables in it. And we can create the users, keep track of the users, we can disable the users, delete the users, all from that one centralized location, right? These are the details that I'm talking about. So I set my password. Am I going to enable the user? Right, so that's what I'm talking about from an activation perspective. That's my keyword right there, enabled. If I set it to false, it will create the user, but that user then can't do anything. So if I'm onboarding a new set of users, I'm bringing in a training class, and I want to get ahead of the time, but I don't want to create that as a whole bunch of users inside my environment. I can go in and create them, but not activate them. So they can't actually do anything inside my environment, but now I know I'm 90% of the way there. Right? Then I just need to run another API where I change false to true, and now they're all activated inside my environment. Right? So very powerful. I also have the ability to update things. Somebody sends in a note and says, hey, I've changed my phone number. Right? I can go into my variable file, type in the new phone number, run my API. It can scroll through and change just that one little piece of information for that user, right? To update that user. I can also change the permissions here. So is he a co-admin of an environment? Is he a tenant admin? Right? True, false. Switch it on, switch it off. Right? Very simple. How am I doing on time? 40 minutes. Oh, crap. So, again, from a curl perspective, I'm posting, right, in my curl command. So remember we talked about the get, the post, the put, the delete. In this instance, I'm posting. I'm piping the response out to response headers.txt, right here. So I know what's happening and I can see the information come back. This is my URL, this is my username, this is my source file of what I want to do, right? So that's my variable file that says I want to see X, Y, and Z. I want to create, this is where I'm getting my variables from, right? So I'm telling the curl command, go find pete.json, and you leverage that to provide the actual file inside of here. Disabling in Cloud Center, you have to disable a user and then delete him. You can't just go in and delete, right? It will give you a bad message. Like I was saying, in Postman, building out the collections, and sorry guys, I'm going a little bit faster because I really wanted to get to the demo and show you something, and I'm not used to presenting in only 45 minutes. So you can build out your collections, and like I said, list users, create users, delete users. You build these collections out so that you don't then have to go back and reinvent the wheel, right? Somebody comes to you and says, okay, have you created Pete yet? Rather than go in the GUI, you come in here, give me a list of users, go. Spits them all out, yep, there he is, I'm good to go. Is he activated? Yes, he is, because I see the enabled flag set to true, right? So, these are the variables. In this instance, I actually created this in an Excel file because I felt Excel would be more friendly if you're just getting started, right? Rather than having to pass through a JSON file and the formatting and did I get the correct comma here, or did I have a squirrely bracket instead of a square bracket, etc. So CSV works just as well. So I create my variables. I've got my C3, I got my ID, I got my password. Is he enabled? First name, last name, etc. all the way across, right? And so now, all I need to do is update this information and then run my API script by calling this information, right? So now I've got a centralized location where I can provide my variables to the API and have it run against the platform, right? And all of this is actually up on the GitHub, so all of this samples, you can pull down what we're going to look at from a demo perspective, and all of this should work for you, assuming you have Cloud Center. If you don't have Cloud Center, it might not work, but you can modify it for your own environment. It's exactly the same. So these are the variables that I'm talking about when we talk about the script, right? So if you think about back here, let me point to an example that's actually there. So C3 enabled, right? So here's my C3 enabled variable. Am I setting it to false or am I setting it to true, right? This is the body of the file inside of the API script that I'm going to run, okay? And so it's going to go through, it wants to set this value, right? But it's going to go look in the file for the value that I want it to be set to. And I can modify that and change it either way to make it happen, okay? And so it allows me to manipulate that data in a great way. For applications, as you can see, and we'll look at this in a second, you've got V1 versions for applications, right? The V1 version of the API that we call back, which will give you a limited piece of information, or you can leverage V2 and you get a tremendous amount more information, right? And so all of these different applications is how you're going to manage your environment in that kind of thing, right? This is the JSON way of looking at it, right? So when I pull back the information, as you can see from my URL, I'm now leveraging V2 apps, how much more information I get, right, versus this, right? Because I'm doing a V1 apps, I kind of get this information, ID 31, again, everything has an ID. This is my resource information. I get my permission set, what the name of the app is, and that's it, right? V2, I get a lot more environment variables, I get a lot more information being pulled back, right? So it all depends on how in-depth you want to go from a perspective of information that you need, information that you want to create, and how you want to leverage the information that's available inside your system, okay? Ooh. All right, so real quick, I'm going to run through a demo. So to do that, I need to pull up some systems information. All right, so here's Postman. This is my preferred tool. Okay, so these would be the collections that we were talking about, right? So, for example, very simple, I can click on send, I want a list of users. I click send, here's my list of users, right? All the way through. This is it starts with my admin, it redacts the password. Now this resource URL, if I want further information on that particular user, I can simply click that. The tool gets updated with what I want, and now I get detailed information on just that particular user, right? So if a user's having issues logging in or something along those lines, I can go and pull out all the information about that user and figure out very quickly, all right, what tenant is he supposed to be in? Is he enabled? Is he supposed to be a tenant admin? Is he a co-admin of something? I have it all listed out right in front of me very simply, right? So now, if I want to create users, so here's a way of me creating users, right? So I have a whole collection called C3. I'm going to give it my variable file, right? So I list that in, and now you'll see, just to show that there's no sleight of hand, this is the UI interface, by the way. And here's my list of users that are currently in the system, right, via the UI. You notice I had to do a lot of clicking, log back into the system because it had timed me out. If I come up to here, I don't have to worry about those things, right? But I can say create my users. Oh, that's not good. Don't you love dive demos? Why didn't that work? Oh, they're all set to false. So this is the real-time variable file that I've created, right? So here's my usernames, here's my passwords, the company that they belong to, etc. And so when I run Postman, I come into my collection. I say I want to create users. I say I want to do my user deployment, right? And I say create my users. And again, here's my status codes coming back telling me, yep, we created it. I created it, I went through the whole file and I created all of those different users, right? So now when I go back to the admin interface, and I have a whole bunch of users, right? From Bobby Sue down to Oh No, even I got a Scooby-Doo, right? All created inside my environment very, very quickly, right? With all the permissions that I actually wanted them to have, the passwords, etc., right? But that's just a very simple example. If I go back and I look at the different deployments that I have inside this environment, right? You can see that I only have one machine deployed, right? Again, if I want to deploy a new machine, I have a system set up, or I have a script that I've gone in and I've said, okay, I want to be able to deploy this machine. Now remember, we were talking about IDs, right? So in this version, I have an application ID of 33. That's going to equate back to a CentOS 7 machine that I want to deploy, right? Now again, it's a single tier platform, so I'm only going to deploy the VM, but I can do exactly the same thing if I want to deploy Nginx, if I want to do SQL, whatever it may be. I set that information up here that says, look, I want you to just deploy the machine first, and then further down in my script, I'm going to call the other IDs and the other information that I want. In this instance, I'm going to deploy it on VMware. I've told it I would specifically want you on this data store inside of VMware, right, on one of my machines. I want you to use this data center, I want you to use this cluster, and I want you to put the VM in this folder, right? So I know exactly where it's going. I know exactly how it's getting there. My cloud properties, again, right? So I'm going to do, I want it to auto-select the network, but I want it to come up on the VM network. So you remember we were talking about the DHCP interaction, right? I'm saying, okay, I want you to use DHCP, and for this, I have it just set up to a Linux DHCP server, but it could also be tied back to info blocks or whatever it may be. And I only want you to deploy one. Now this is important. Remember we were talking about the templates inside the environment? The templates control the number of CPUs, the amount of RAM that's in the box, hard disk size, etc. Right? So in this one, I'm telling it to use the silver profile, right? And silver profile in this instance is 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, right? And all of this is variable, so when we were looking at that Excel, the Excel file, the CSV, I can make all of these variables. So I can say, okay, I want to deploy X server. I put a variable in there, and you say, okay, you get the silver, you get the bronze, or we tie it to a service catalog, and the service catalog, the user actually gets to pick it, and then that variable gets passed through to the API and populated in here. Okay? In this instance, I'm going to call the server Scooby-Doo. And so from there, I now say send, and I'm done. Right? It's created the server, or it's creating the server, right? So now if I go back over to my different environments, you can see this is my VMware cloud. I'm cloning the machine. Right, so that's going to take a few seconds, but imagine this is being seen from a service catalog perspective, right? The user has gone through, he's selected the VM that he wants, the type of VM or the application that he wants. He's clicked submit, he's said, okay, I'm happy with that cost perspective, I'm happy with that profile. I hit submit, and now in the back end, all of the APIs are talking to the different platforms to say, hey, your user selected this, we're getting it deployed inside the environment, right? So I've cloned the machine, I'm setting all the criteria on the machine, right? So I've now changed the machine name to Scooby-Doo. And so to see that now, right? So from your perspective, you hit send, you know it's going to happen on the back end, right? You're done from your perspective now, or from a service catalog perspective, you're done. However, just for the sakes of a demonstration, bear in mind this is a live demonstration, so extra kudos to me. From the VMware perspective, right, we have it's starting up. There's my cost basis, right? So I've said this profile is only $1 per hour, right? So per month it's going to cost the user $730. And I can go in and look at the details of that specific user or that specific machine. As you can see, here's the instance type that I told it I wanted to use. I pulled my IP address, and it's now up and running, and now I've got my actions where I can actually say, all right, if I want to SSH into that machine, then I can do that via the IP, right? But now I have a machine up and running inside the environment. And I'm going long, guys. I apologize. All right, and then I can just sync the VM information, and you'll see the operating system, you see my IP address, you can see when it started, my cost perspective, et cetera, right? Across all the information. Again, from an ops perspective, you're not that worried because it's happened in the back end and the APIs will then notify you if something happens to go wrong. This is a very simple example of deploying a single machine, but this could be very easily be an entire environment based on that workflow that we looked at earlier, right? Just to wrap up real quick, so what I've done is put at the back of the deck the different function APIs that we were looking at, and then I gave you the URL to actually get to that information inside there if you'd find that useful. Gives you an idea of how to dig into that API in a little more detail, right? So V2 tenants, getting tenant information, etc. This code is up on the GitHub, like I said, it's in the deck. This will be available for you to download the deck. So the different codes, the documentation code and the GitHub code will be in there. So these scripts will be there for you to leverage and play with outside of here. If you liked the presentation, please go in and do the survey. If you liked it, I'm Pete. If you didn't, I'm Jerry. But yeah, it's a great way for us to get feedback. So thank you very much.